Welcome to my presentation on the topic of the paper that we submitted to Frontiers, to the special issue of Frontiers. It's about control and eradication programs for non-EU regulated cattle diseases in the Netherlands. Here you can only see my name, but there was a big group of people from my country involved, because what we have in our country is that we have a group of specialists for every program that we conduct. So given that I'm telling something about multiple diseases and multiple control program, there were a lot of people involved in the whole process who I should acknowledge. So a little bit of context, what I included in the paper and what you should know when interpreting my story is that the Netherlands is a high dense country with many cattle herds on a very small surface. And you can see here in the right bottom corner some density maps, left for dairy and right for non-dairy, and the darker the color, the more intense, the more herds per area. So because we are a very dense country and we are very good in trading cattle, in importing and exporting products and animals, we need a strict monitoring and surveillance system. So we have a lot of monitoring and surveillance programs and efforts in place. And I think the big advantage that we have is also that we are only a small country and that we have a high quality data infrastructure, and that we have often have only singular companies in charge of something. So we have one company in charge of milk quality control and one company in charge of all the renderings in the Netherlands. And that makes running a program and incorporating data less complicated compared to other countries, because we only have to deal with a single data source. Well, in this paper, we tried to focus on the control programs for non-regulated cattle diseases that we have in the Netherlands. And the focus in our paper was on 6 endemic cattle infections in the Netherlands. So BVD, bovine herpes virus type 1, salmonella, paratuberculosis, leptospirosis, and neosporosis. So what I describe in the paper is that every control program for every infection has its own design that fits best to the Dutch situation. And we are focused in all our programs, we focus on cost efficiency and labor sparing activities, so that it does not cost any time for the farmer to participate, at least as much as possible. So in the paper, I included a very thorough description of every program and included links to more detailed information. So here I remain very rough, but I think I highlighted some important aspects per disease. So for example, for BVD, we aim to detect and remove PIs, and in the end to get the herd free and lower the prevalence. The surveillance is based on bulk milk sampling, ear notch sampling, and blood sampling. And the strategy is depending on whether the infection is present in the herd or not, and the time since the last infection was detected. We control the risk of purchase, but also when animals with clinical signs occur, additional sampling is done. And for BVD, vaccination is allowed. So approximately 20 to 25% of our dairy herds vaccinate. And another very important thing to be aware of is that for the dairy herds, it's since 2018, it's mandatory to participate in the control program. For non-dairy herds, it's voluntary. For bovine herpes virus type 1, we focus on detection and removal of antibody positive animals, or when too many antibody positive animals are present, to vaccinate. Again, surveillance is based on bulk milk and blood sampling. And again, the risk of purchase is controlled. And also we try to control the risk by conducting additional sampling on animals with clinical signs that may be indicated for IBR. Again, for dairy herds, the program is mandatory, and for non-dairy herds, the program is voluntary. And here you can immediately see the weakness of our programs, the fact that it's not mandatory for all cattle herds, but I come back to that later. Well, for leptospirosis, the dairy herds need to be antibody positive, and it's mandatory for them to be free. So later on, I will show you some results, and you can see that almost 100% of the herds are free. So they need to be free to be able to deliver their milk in the Netherlands. And in case of a large outbreak, it's recommended to conduct a group treatment because vaccination is not allowed in the Netherlands. And again, we control the risk of purchase. And then in this case, mainly a purchase from non-dairy herds and imports. For Salmonella, we do surveillance on bulk milk samples, and that's mandatory. For every dairy farmer has to conduct a bulk milk evaluation 3 times per year, and they are obliged to be negative. And if they are not negative, they have to take action. And we have a voluntary program, or when they are conducting a follow-up, we also do some blood sampling. We focus on detection and removal of positive cattle. And in the Netherlands, there are 2 programs in place. So a mandatory program for dairy herds, which is focusing on testing of bulk milk samples, and a voluntary control program, and all cattle herds can participate in that program. And when you test positive in the bulk milk program, you are directed to the voluntary control program. And again, in the voluntary control program, we control the risk of purchase. For paratuberculosis, we also have a mandatory program in dairy herds to do, here I say a bulk milk evaluation, but this is incorrect. It is an annual evaluation of individual milk samples. And again, there are 2 programs in place, a mandatory program for dairy herds and a voluntary program for non-dairy herds. And last but not least is our neosporosis program, which is completely voluntary. And this program is focusing on taking action when problems with a lot of abortions occur, and biosecurity measures are advised to decrease horizontal and vertical transmission. So that's very short, well, some key aspects of the program, but in the paper it's explained in much more detail with schemes and a complete strategy. So the control programs are coordinated by Royal GD with help of a very large software program. And at Royal GD we have expert, but we also have a large laboratory. So we conduct the sampling, and then the results are communicated automatically to the farmer and the veterinarian. And using this program, we can also monitor if something happens in the herd. So for example, when a herd purchases a cow, the program is automatically notified, and then it sends out an automatic notification to the farmer and his vet that a certain animal has to be tested for a certain disease within a certain time period. So with that, we focus on labor sparing and cost efficient control program. And another thing that we do with help of this program is automatic selection of milk samples that are routinely collected. So as I mentioned previously, we have a quality control company that does quality control of all the dairy herds in the Netherlands. And in collaboration with that company, we can automatically select certain milk samples, bulk milk samples from certain herds or certain animals within a herd. So there's no labor at all for the farmer. We can just say which sample we need and they will send it to us. And this program also enables us to include routinely collected movement data. So when you look at participation rates, on the left, the dairy herds, on the right, the suckler herds, and what you immediately can see is that the dairy herds, when you look at leptospirosis, I did not plot the number of participants, but the number of herds that are classified as free. You can see that it's very close to 100%. And sometimes we have new introductions, mainly because of imports, but then we take action that those herds become free again. So it's very close to 100%. Here you have the Salmonella bulk milk antibody negative program. So the national program for dairy herds. And here you can see that more than 90%, and now we are moving to 97% of the herds are classified as antibody negative. And what you, well, Gerdien told something about this after the presentation of Lisa Nielsen from Denmark. Here we conducted some additional efforts where they herds that were not able to get rid of salmonellosis, they were assigned an external expert that started to help them to take additional biosecurity measures. So not their own vet, but an external vet specialized in salmonella. And you can see that that really helped pushing the number of negative herds closer to 100%. Here you see the results of our paratuberculosis program. So it's around 80% of the programs of the herds that have antibody negative milk samples every year. And for BVD and IBR, we started the mandatory programs in 2018. And here you can see that the number of free herds is increasing. And I think in 2020, it's even going over 70% for BVD. And I think also something around that percentage for IBR. And Neospora, it's purely a participation rate. So here you can see the dairy herds are doing really well with increasing freedom from the endemic diseases. On the other hand, for the suckler herds where we have the voluntary programs, you can see that the participation rates or the percentage of free herds remain stable or even decrease for leptospirosis because they are not really focusing on getting a free status. But this also means that this may be a risk, these herds may be a risk for dairy herds. However, what we also do in the Netherlands is biannual prevalence surveys. And when you look at the results of those surveys, here for dairy and here again for non-dairy, you can see when you look at those pictures in general that the prevalences are decreasing, and not only in dairy herds, but also in the non-dairy herds. So it appears that eradicating the disease from dairy herds also reduces the risk for non-dairy herds, and that the prevalence in those herds are decreasing similarly. So for example, for leptospirosis, we know that the dairy herds are almost free, but we saw declining participation rates in non-dairy herds. But when we look at the prevalence, we see that the prevalence is decreasing also to very low levels. And also for the other diseases, for BVD, for example, you see a decline in both sectors. And also for salmonellosis, you see the same. So again, this is sort of a very rough, well, description of what we did and what we described in our paper. So when we, of course, there are always some discussion points. So we present what we are doing in our country and what the result is of our efforts. And these results is only valid for a certain context. So in this case, for a gross exporting country and importing country with a high quality, a high cattle density, a very high rate of cattle movement between herds. But also high quality data infrastructure and a very good early warning system that immediately notifies farmers and vets when something is going on. The Dutch strategy in general is to start on a voluntary basis and to over time move towards mandatory control. So for all diseases, but well, especially interesting for BVD and IBR, in 2018, we started with mandatory control, but there was a very long period of voluntary control preceding that moment. And what we see that for us, this strategy works really well because we always have farmers who strive to have a very high health status, and everyone is already getting used to the fact that you can become free and that you can get a higher health status and that you can purchase animals of herds with a high health status. And then in time, we move towards mandatory control. Drivers for control in dairy herds are, well, of course, to reduce the disease prevalence and the associated losses. But much of our programs are pressed by the Dutch dairy industry, and they also aim to prevent the occurrence of zoonotic infections and to deliver high quality products derived from healthy cows. So given the fact that we are an exporting country, we strive to a very high health status of our products, and that is only one of the drivers and motivations to start mandatory control in the dairy herds. Well, I already mentioned we focus on disease control and elimination while taking cost effectiveness into account, and we monitor the progress both in dairy and non-dairy herds. However, the major setback is that given the fact that the programs remain voluntary in non-dairy herds, complete eradication from infection will probably not be reached unless rules are changed and the government steps in. But that's the fact with non-regulated diseases. It's up to the industry to take action, and well, our dairy industry does want to take action, but the non-dairy industry is not very well organized, so most efforts remain voluntary for them.